The snow fell softly that evening in slow, drifting flakes that settled over the quiet park like dust on a forgotten memory. Each snowflake seemed to carry its own weight, its own story, descending through the darkness with purpose and grace. 1 week before Christmas, and the city was lit with cheer, window displays blinking red and green, carols piping from distant storefronts that stayed open late to catch last-minute shoppers. Children pressed their noses against frosted glass, pointing at electric trains and stuffed animals. Families hurried past with shopping bags and laughter trailing behind them like ribbons. But here, beside the frozen lake where children once skated years ago, everything was still. The ice stretched out like a mirror forgotten by time, cracked and opaque beneath layers of fresh powder. Callum Reed sat alone on a cold iron bench, his coat buttoned to the top, a grey cashmere scarf wound neatly around his neck. The leather gloves on his hands, Italian-made and expensive, did not stop the cold from seeping in. It crept through the material, through his skin, settling somewhere deeper, somewhere the cold had lived for years. Beside him on the bench, a paper coffee cup sat untouched, its logo faded and peeling. The steam had long since faded, leaving only lukewarm liquid that no longer held any appeal. In his other hand, he held a small velvet gift box, unopened. Inside was a watch, platinum and engraved, a gift from his board of directors. For another year of excellence, the card had read. He hadn't opened it. He wasn't sure he wanted to. His eyes were bloodshot, though he had not cried. He did not cry anymore. Not since he was 9 years old and sitting in a group home on Christmas Eve, waiting for someone, anyone, to choose him. The other children had been picked up one by one, their faces lighting up as social workers called their names. But his name never came. He sat by the window, watching car headlights sweep past, each one a possibility, each one a disappointment. Too small, the social worker had said later, not unkindly, her voice soft with regret. Too quiet. The families wanted children who smiled more, who talked more, who seemed less broken. So he stopped waiting. He stopped hoping. And years later, when he had built everything himself, his tech empire valued at over $2 billion, his penthouse apartment overlooking the city skyline, the admiration of an entire industry that hung on his every keynote speech, he still returned, without meaning to that boy on the bench, waiting. Watching. Hoping for nothing. This year, the loneliness felt worse, sharper, like the success had grown too big, too loud, and he had grown smaller in its shadow. The accolades meant nothing. The applause at conferences faded the moment he left the stage. The articles written about him called him a visionary, a genius, a self-made man. But they never mentioned the silence of his apartment at night, the way his voice echoed when he spoke aloud to no one, the meals he ate standing at the kitchen counter because sitting at a table alone felt too much like admitting defeat. A laugh echoed distantly across the park, pulling him from his thoughts. Callum looked up, his breath misting in the cold air. 2 figures walked slowly along the snow-covered path, their footsteps crunching softly. A woman in a thick gray wool coat, her blonde hair pulled into a low, simple ponytail that swayed gently as she moved, and beside her, a small boy in a puffy red jacket, wearing a knit hat with fuzzy bear ears that flopped with each step. He clutched a large paper bag against his chest, its sides crinkled with grease spots and warmth. The scent of fresh-baked cookies drifted faintly through the cold air. They stopped near a bench across from Callum's, about 20 feet away. The woman bent down, her movements gentle and unhurried, pulling out a bundle wrapped in wax paper and handing it to a man hunched beneath a threadbare blanket, his shoulders dusted with snow. She smiled as she spoke, her voice too soft for Callum to hear, but he could see the man's face change, the hard lines softening, his eyes misting with something that might have been gratitude or relief or simply the shock of being noticed. The boy stood beside his mother, watching intently, his small face serious and attentive. Then the two moved on, the woman's hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder as they continued down the path. Callum watched them disappear into the falling snow, then looked down at the velvet box in his hand again, still unopened, still meaningless. What was the point of expensive things when they came with no one to share them with? What was the point of success when it only amplified the emptiness? "Mommy," he looked sad. The boy's voice was soft, curious, cutting through the quiet like a bell. Callum glanced up sharply and saw the boy looking directly at him, his gloved hand tugging insistently at his mother's coat. She followed his gaze, her eyes meeting Callum's for just a moment, and immediately she looked unsure, the way people do when they accidentally intrude on private grief. She whispered something to the boy, her voice low and urgent, and tried to gently guide him away, her hand on his back. But the boy pulled free with the determination only a child possesses when they believe something is important. He walked up to Callum, small boots crunching in the snow with each step, and tilted his head slightly as he peered up with wide, guileless eyes that held no judgment, no pity, only pure concern. "Don't cry, mister," he said, his voice clear and earnest. "You can borrow my mom." The words hit Callum like a gust of wind straight to the chest. Unexpected. Pure. Impossible to brace for. He stared, speechless, his mouth slightly open, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. He had no words. None came. He did not remember the last time anyone had spoken to him like that, not from pity, not from some performative kindness meant to be photographed and posted, but simply from noticing. From caring. The woman hurried forward, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold or from embarrassment, he couldn't tell which. "I am so sorry," she said quickly, her voice carrying a hint of mortification. "He's very friendly. Too friendly sometimes." But even as she apologized, she did not pull the boy away. Instead, she reached into the paper bag, pulled out a cookie wrapped carefully in wax paper, and held it out with a hesitant smile that reached her eyes. "Merry Christmas," she said softly. "It's probably sweeter than necessary. Like Jamie." Callum looked at her. Really looked. Her eyes were tired, the kind of tired that came from working long hours and worrying about bills and doing everything alone, but they were kind. Gentle. Her hands, slightly red from the cold, held the cookie like it was something worth offering, something valuable. Her voice had no pity in it, no awkward apology laced with discomfort, just warmth. Simple, uncomplicated warmth. He reached out slowly, almost hesitantly, and took the cookie. His fingers brushed hers barely, the contact lasting only a second, but they trembled, and not from the cold. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rougher than he intended. She nodded, already turning to guide Jamie away, her hand resting on his shoulder. But the boy lingered just a moment longer, turning back to wave with his whole arm, his face breaking into a grin that showed a missing front tooth. "She's really nice, mister," Jamie added with complete sincerity. "You'll feel better if you eat the whole thing." And then they were gone, disappearing down the snowy path, the boy's voice trailing into the night as he chatted about gingerbread houses and Christmas lights and whether Santa's reindeer could actually fly or if they just jumped really high. The woman's soft laughter floated back, barely audible, like music heard through a closed door. Callum sat still, frozen in place, the cookie warm in his gloved hand. It felt heavier than the gift box on the bench beside him, and far, far more real. He looked down at it, at the crinkled wax paper and the imperfect edges where it had been cut by hand, and something inside him, something that had been locked tight for years, shifted, just slightly. Just enough to hurt. He unwrapped it slowly and took a bite. It was sweet, almost too sweet, with chunks of chocolate and a hint of cinnamon. Homemade. Made with care. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, something tasted like it mattered. Elise was about to lead Jamie home, her hand already reaching for his, when the voice behind her, gentle, uncertain, almost fragile, called out. "Is there a place nearby?" A pause. "I mean, where I could buy you two a hot chocolate." She turned, surprised, her blonde ponytail swinging slightly. Callum stood where they had left him, the cookie now half-eaten in his gloved hand, the gift box tucked under one arm. His expression was difficult to read, tentative, almost shy, like someone out of practice at asking for things, especially things like company. Elise hesitated. Her instinct was always caution. She didn't know this man. Didn't know what he wanted. But something about him, the way he stood there, waiting for rejection, expecting it almost, made her pause. She glanced down at Jamie, who was already beaming. "Yes." Jamie exclaimed before she could answer. "There's a cozy one just around the corner. They have marshmallows shaped like snowmen." And that was that. When a 6-year-old decides something, the world tends to follow. The cafe was tucked between a bookstore with sagging shelves visible through fogged windows and a florist whose window displayed arrangements of holly and white roses. Its windows glowed with warm golden light, gently fogged from the heat inside, and through the glass, shelves of pastries and cinnamon sticks lined the counter in neat, inviting rows. A wreath hung crookedly above the door, its red bough slightly crushed on one side, and a small chalkboard sign announced, "Hot cocoa, made with love and too much whipped cream." They stepped inside, and the warmth enveloped them immediately. The scent of cloves, cocoa, and pine wrapped around them like a soft scarf. Somewhere in the back, a radio played quiet jazz, and the hiss of the espresso machine provided a gentle rhythm. Jamie bounded ahead to a corner table near the small fireplace, where flames crackled behind a protective screen, casting dancing shadows on the brick wall. Elise and Callum followed more slowly, shaking snow from their shoulders. They took their seats, Callum across from Elise, Jamie beside her, swinging his legs beneath the chair, and the fire crackled quietly beside them, filling the silence with something other than words. Outside, through the fogged window, snow continued to fall in a steady, hypnotic hush. Jamie leaned forward, breathless with excitement, his hat now pushed back on his head. "We have a tree at home," he announced proudly. "It's only 3 feet tall, but it has real candy canes. And I made a star out of glitter and cardboard. Mommy says it's the best star she's ever seen." "That sounds magical," Callum said softly, and he meant it. There was something about the way Jamie spoke, with such earnest pride over something so small, that made Callum's chest ache. Elise smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and opened her canvas bag, pulling out a silver thermos that was dented on one side from years of use. "I usually bring this for Jamie after we make our cookie rounds," she explained, unscrewing the cap. The scent of rich hot chocolate wafted out, sweet and comforting. She poured the steaming liquid into 2 paper cups she'd packed, their sides slightly crumpled. One she handed to Jamie, who accepted it with both hands like it was treasure. The other she offered to Callum. He accepted it carefully, his fingers brushing hers again, just for a moment, and this time he noticed how small her hands were, how capable they seemed despite being red from the cold. "It's been a long time," he said quietly, almost to himself, "since anyone poured something warm for me." Elise didn't ask why. She didn't press. She simply said, her voice gentle and matter-of-fact, "Jamie is terrible at ignoring people who look sad. That part he gets from me. Callum gave a small nod and looked down at the cup in his hands. The steam rose gently, curling upward like breath in the cold, and he watched it, mesmerized. Across from him, Elise tucked a loose strand of golden hair behind her ear, then turned her attention to Jamie, wiping a spot of chocolate from his chin with a napkin she pulled from her bag. She laughed at something he whispered, leaning in close to hear it better, and Callum found himself watching them, not out of curiosity, but out of something quieter, something closer to longing. There was no performance in her, no false cheer or forced holiday spirit. Just a softness, a steadiness, like someone who had learned to make peace with what she had and make it enough. The small table lamp beside them cast a gentle glow on her face, and the edges of her pale blonde hair shimmered in the light, catching gold and silver. For a moment, she looked like she belonged to some quiet story he had once forgotten how to read, the kind of story that didn't have dramatic plot twists or grand gestures, just ordinary moments strung together until they became something beautiful. Jamie turned to him suddenly, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Do you have a tree, mister?" Callum blinked, pulled from his thoughts. "A tree? For Christmas?" "Yeah. With lights and ornaments and everything." "Oh." Callum smiled, a small, self-conscious smile. "Just the one in the office lobby. Not sure it counts. Someone else decorates it. I just walk past it." Elise looked at him then, her expression gentle but thoughtful. "Every tree counts," she said softly, "as long as someone looks at it with belief." Something in her voice, simple, unassuming, carrying no judgment, touched something tender in him, something he'd thought had calcified years ago. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Callum smiled. Not the polite, practiced smile he gave in boardrooms or during interviews, the one that never reached his eyes. But a real one. Small, fragile, true. Jamie grinned, delighted. "You look nicer when you smile, mister. You should do it more." Callum chuckled softly, the sound rusty from disuse. "I'll try to remember that." They sat like that for a while, talking in fits and starts, sipping cocoa that had gone from scalding to perfectly warm, watching the fire glow and shift. Elise did not ask what he did for work, though his tailored coat and expensive watch probably gave it away. Jamie did not ask why he had looked so sad, why he'd been sitting alone in the snow. And Callum did not ask why two people with so little warmth to spare had chosen to share it with a stranger anyway. But something in him, something long frozen and buried deep, began to shift. The ice around his heart didn't crack all at once, it was too thick for that, built up over too many years, but it softened, just at the edges. Just enough to let in a little light. He still didn't know their last name. Didn't know where they lived or what Elise did for work or why Jamie's father wasn't in the picture. But he already knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that this night would stay with him. Maybe longer than any gift, any award, any accomplishment ever could. When they finally said goodbye outside the cafe, snow still falling softly around them, Jamie waved with both hands. "Bye, mister. Don't be sad anymore, okay?" Callum nodded, his throat tight. "I'll try." And as he watched them walk away, Elisa's hand resting gently on Jamie's shoulder, her blonde ponytail swaying, he realized something. For the first time in years, he didn't want to be alone. The living room was quiet that night, save for the ticking of the old wall clock and the occasional rustle of papers as Elise shifted through folders. She sat cross-legged on the worn rug, her blonde hair loosely tied back, several strands falling across her cheek as she leaned over a pile of folders spread out across the coffee table like a chaotic mosaic. Outside, snow gathered softly along the railing of her small balcony, piling up in gentle drifts. Inside was warm, filled with the lingering scent of cinnamon from the cookies they'd baked earlier and the faint smell of printer ink from the stack of documents she'd brought home from work. She was working late again, as she often did after Jamie fell asleep, preparing a detailed proposal for a children's interactive theater program she hoped to launch in the new year. The concept had been inspired by Jamie, his vivid imagination, the way stories lit up his entire face, the way he could turn a cardboard box into a spaceship or a blanket fort into a castle. She wanted to build something that made children like him feel seen, valued, like their imaginations mattered. The proposal outlined workshops, performances, volunteer opportunities for local kids, especially those from shelters or difficult backgrounds. It was ambitious. Maybe too ambitious. But it felt important. In search of old material and inspiration, she decided to go through one of the last storage boxes belonging to her mother, who had passed away 4 years earlier after a sudden illness. Her mother had been a social worker for over 20 years, dedicating her life to children in the foster system. She often brought them home temporarily, offering short-term care when placements fell through or when a child needed somewhere safe to stay for a few days. Elise remembered fragments from those years, names she'd long forgotten, quiet faces at the dinner table, brief visits from kids who stayed in their small home for a few days, sometimes a week, before moving on to somewhere more permanent. As she sifted through the folders, yellowed documents and faded photographs spilling out, a thin manila folder caught her eye. It was older than the rest, its edges soft and frayed from years of handling. The paper had yellowed to a dull cream, and a rusted paper clip held several pages together. Typed in fading ink on the top sheet, barely legible, were the words, Callum Reed. Temporary care. December 1999, ***. Elise froze, her fingers suddenly trembling. She sat upright, her heart beginning to race, and carefully opened the folder. Inside was a black and white school photo, the kind taken every year with awkward backgrounds and forced smiles. A boy, about 9 years old, stared back at her. Dark hair that fell into his eyes. Large, weary eyes that seemed far older than they should. His expression was unreadable, not quite sad, not quite angry, but something underneath it all, sadness, yes, but also a kind of silent defense, a wall built to keep the world out. And then the memory returned, rushing back like water through a broken dam. She had been 9 that winter too. It was just before Christmas, and her mother had brought home a boy to stay for a week while his case was being reassigned. He was quiet, almost painfully so, withdrawn and wary. He spent most of his time staring out the window, watching the snow fall, clutching a long red scarf in his hands like it was the only thing tethering him to the world. Elise remembered feeling a mixture of curiosity and concern. She wanted to talk to him, to make him smile, but he barely spoke. He answered questions with single words, ate meals in silence, and went to bed early, closing the guest room doors softly behind him. One night, unable to sleep and feeling like she had to do something, anything, Elise had drawn a picture. A reindeer, wobbly and childish, with crooked antlers and a giant red nose. She'd colored it in with crayons, working carefully, trying to make it perfect. Then she'd written at the bottom, in her messy 9-year-old handwriting, "You deserve a Christmas too." She'd folded it carefully and slipped it under the boy's door. The next morning, she found it resting on top of his small suitcase, smoothed out and creased along the folds where he'd held it. When he left, when the social worker came to pick him up, he had hugged Elise goodbye, tightly, desperately, and she'd felt him cry, his small body shaking, though he made no sound. And then he was gone. She never knew what happened to him. Never knew his name, not really. Just the boy from December. And now, after all these years, sitting in her quiet living room with snow falling outside, that boy had a name. Callum Reed, the same man who had been sitting alone on the park bench that cold evening last week, staring at nothing with eyes that still, after all these years, looked unbearably alone. The man who now wore tailored coats and spoke with quiet authority, whose name appeared in business magazines and tech blogs, who had built an empire from nothing. But whose eyes still carried that same sadness. Elise stared at the photo for a long time, her mind racing, her heart aching. She thought about the little boy who had clutched a red scarf and cried silently. And she thought about the man who had accepted a cookie from a stranger with hands that trembled. They were the same person. And without fully understanding why, she knew she had to tell him. 2 days later, Elise gathered her courage and sent a simple text message to the number Callum had given her when they'd exchanged contact information at the cafe. *, would you like to meet for coffee? There's something I'd like to show you. *, his reply came within minutes, almost as if he'd been waiting. *, yes. When, *, they agreed to meet that afternoon. The cafe was different from the cozy one they'd visited with Jamie. This one was tucked off the main square, quieter, more intimate. Wooden tables scarred with years of use. Soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. Walls lined with old books, their spines cracked and faded. The kind of place where people came to think, to read, to escape. Elise arrived first, her canvas bag clutched tightly against her side, and found them a quiet corner table near the back, away from the windows. When Callum walked in 10 minutes later, tall and deliberate, snow melting on the shoulders of his black overcoat, she felt her heart stutter. He looked different somehow, more uncertain, more human. Less like the polished CEO and more like the boy in the photograph. He spotted her and made his way over, sliding into the seat across from her. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi." She smiled, but it was quieter than usual, tinged with something he couldn't quite read. They ordered black coffee for him, chamomile tea for her, and when the drinks arrived, Elise reached into her bag. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out the manila folder and placed it gently on the table between them. Callum looked at it, then at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "What's this?" She spoke softly, carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember A Small House Outside Town? December 1999. He said nothing. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, recognition, maybe, or fear. She opened the folder slowly, almost reverently, and slid the black and white photo toward him. "I think," she said gently, "we met before." Callum stared at the photo. At the boy with dark hair and sad eyes. At the name typed on the page. His hands, resting on the table, curled slowly into fists. "You stayed with us for a week," Elise continued, her voice thick with emotion. "You had a red scarf. You barely spoke. And I." She swallowed hard. "I drew you a reindeer." The world seemed to stop. Callum didn't move. Didn't breathe. And then, very slowly, he looked up at her, and his eyes were wet. "I kept that drawing," he whispered, his voice breaking. "For years. I folded it so many times it tore at the creases. He let out a shaky breath, almost a laugh, bitter and sad. "I lost it when I moved into my first apartment. A shoebox full of things, and it was the only thing that mattered. I looked for it everywhere. Tore the place apart." He paused, his jaw tight. "I never found it." Elisa's vision blurred with tears. "I drew terribly back then." "No," he said fiercely, his voice raw. "No, you don't understand. It was the only thing that made me feel like I wasn't invisible. He looked up at her, the careful mask he always wore completely gone, stripped away. You told me I deserved a Christmas. I never forgot that. Not once. She nodded, unable to speak, tears slipping down her cheeks. The spoon in his hand, which he'd been absently holding, tapped once against the saucer, then stilled. No dramatic tears. No sweeping gesture. Just a stillness, deep and quiet and full of a grief that had waited 25 years to be acknowledged. And for the first time, Callum looked at Elise, not as a kind stranger who had offered him a cookie, not as the woman with cocoa and calm in her voice, but as someone who, unknowingly, had once saved a small part of him. And had just given it back. The days that followed felt different. Lighter, somehow, though nothing had fundamentally changed. Callum found himself texting Elise more often, small things, inconsequential things. A photo of the office Christmas tree with the caption "Still doesn't count," a question about what kind of cookies Jamie liked. An article about children's theater programs that he thought she might find useful. And she always replied. Always warmly. Always with that same gentle humor that made him feel less alone. They met for coffee again. And then again. Sometimes Jamie came along, chattering about school and Christmas lists and whether penguins could live in the city if they wore sweaters. Sometimes it was just the two of them, talking quietly in corner booths, sharing stories they'd never told anyone else. Callum learned that Elise had been a single mother for 4 years, that Jamie's father had left before the boy was even born, that she worked 2 part-time jobs while pursuing her theater program on the side. He learned that she was tired, yes, but not broken. That she had a strength in her that was quiet but unshakable. And Elise learned that Callum's success had come at a cost, that he worked 16-hour days because going home to an empty apartment felt worse than staying at the office, that he had never learned how to let people in because no one had ever stayed long enough to teach him. They didn't talk about what they were becoming. Didn't label it. But something was growing between them, fragile and real. And then everything nearly fell apart. The soft buzz of the community theater still echoed in Elisa's ears as she walked home that evening, exhausted but glowing. The trial run of the children's play had just wrapped, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to exhale, to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was going to work. Parents had clapped. Children had giggled and bowed. Volunteers had beamed with pride. Elise had stood at the edge of the stage, her blonde ponytail loose from the rush of the day, her gray cardigan dusted with glitter from a prop star that had shed sparkles everywhere. She was tired, bone-tired, but happy. Truly happy. Months of quiet labor had led to this moment. Late nights stitching together scenes between Jamie's bedtime stories, rewriting dialogue until it felt just right, coordinating with volunteers, begging for donations. Every line of the script had been rooted in kindness, in wonder, in the things she used to dream about as a child when she believed stories could change the world. The cast had been made up of local kids, some from shelters, some with speech delays, some who were simply overlooked in their schools. But they had sung. They had danced. They had shown. And watching them, Elise had felt, for the first time in a long time, like she was doing something that mattered. She smiled all the way home, replaying moments in her mind, the little girl who had forgotten her line and improvised something even better, the boy who had been too shy to speak above a whisper but had belted out his song with surprising confidence. She went to bed that night feeling hopeful. And woke up the next morning to a nightmare. She saw the post before she finished her tea, still in her pajamas, Jamie still asleep in his room. An anonymous blog article had begun circulating online, shared and reshared across social media. The headline was damning, local theater director accused of plagiarism. Did she steal her original script? Elisa's hands trembled as she read. The article was professionally written, polished, venomous. It claimed, with cherry-picked evidence and strategically placed screenshots, that her script was suspiciously similar to a lesser-known children's play from 3 years prior. Side-by-side comparisons were displayed, lines taken out of context, scenes that only superficially resembled each other. The anonymous author, clearly someone with inside access, suggested that Elise had repackaged an old idea under the guise of charity, exploiting children's stories for personal gain. The post spread like wildfire. Comments piled up. Some defended her. Most didn't. By mid-morning, it had been shared in local parenting groups, community forums, even picked up by a local news blog looking for controversy. By afternoon, the play's main sponsor, a small local foundation, sent an email. Professional. Apologetic. Devastating. * We need to pause funding pending a full review of the plagiarism allegations. We hope you understand. Elise stared at the screen, numb. She knew who had written it. A former collaborator she'd worked with 2 years ago, someone brilliant but erratic and, ultimately, dishonest. They'd parted ways after Elise discovered they'd been taking credit for other people's work. She had chosen integrity over popularity, had quietly stepped away rather than cause drama. And now it was backfiring. A few collaborators grew distant, their texts carefully neutral. One dropped out entirely, citing scheduling conflicts. The whispers started, not loud, but there. Enough to plant doubt. Still, Elise did not go online to defend herself. Did not write angry responses or post evidence. She simply went back to work, quietly printing handouts for the kids who would be coming in for the next rehearsal. Her fingers trembled a little as she stapled the corners, but she didn't stop. She would not let this destroy what they'd built. Not for the kids. Meanwhile, across the city, Jamie sat cross-legged on the floor of Callum's office, a place he'd visited several times now. He'd come by after school with a holiday card he'd made himself, construction paper folded unevenly, covered in glitter glue explosions that left sparkles on everything he touched. Callum had cleared a space for him near the window, away from the important documents and expensive equipment, and given him juice in a paper cup and a plate of cookies from the company cafeteria. While Jamie sipped his juice, he looked up, his expression unusually serious. Did you know people are saying my mom stole her play? Callum, who had been reviewing a contract, froze. He set down his pen carefully. Where did you hear that? His voice was too calm, too controlled. Some kids at school, Jamie replied, swinging his legs. Their parents saw it on their phones. But I told them they're wrong. He bit his straw thoughtfully. My mom wouldn't steal. She even told me not to take crayons home from school if they're not mine. That was all Callum needed to hear. He said nothing more to Jamie, just gave him a half smile and a second cookie. But the moment Jamie's grandmother picked him up an hour later, Callum made a call. Get me everything, he told his head of legal. I want the original drafts, timestamps, witnesses, communications, everything. And I want to know who wrote that article. Sir, this isn't company business, I don't care. Do it. Within 24 hours, the response was ready. A formal statement, issued by Reed and Holt Legal Affairs, thorough and devastating in its precision. It included proof of Elisa's original drafts, all time-stamped and saved in cloud storage. Testimony from educators she'd consulted. Planning documents that predated the supposedly similar play by over a year. Email chains. Meeting notes. Everything. And then, the masterstroke, the anonymous blog post's author was unmasked. IP traced. Identity confirmed. A cease and desist letter was filed. A defamation lawsuit followed. The response rippled fast through the same social media channels that had spread the accusation. The sponsor emailed Elise the next morning, their tone apologetic, almost embarrassed. We've reviewed the new information and are reinstating funding immediately. We apologize for any distress caused. We believe in your vision and are committed to supporting this program fully. Elise blinked at the screen, reading the email 3 times to make sure it was real. Then she checked her phone. Still nothing from Callum. She called him. He picked up on the first ring. Elise. You did something, didn't you? Her voice was soft, thick with emotion. A pause. I did what anyone should, he replied quietly, for someone who deserves better. Silence. Then her voice broke. I'm not used to being protected. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw. I used to say that too. But no one should get used to being alone. Her throat tightened. Her eyes filled. And for the first time in a long time, Elise cried, not from fear, not from injustice, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen. Of being backed without having to ask. Of not being alone. Across town, rehearsals resumed. The children returned, bright-eyed and eager. The curtains would rise again. But Elise knew, this time, if they fell, she wouldn't be falling alone. It started with a question, innocent, thoughtless, the kind children ask without understanding the weight their words carry. Jamie's classroom had been discussing family trees, holiday traditions, who would be visiting whom for Christmas. The teacher had passed out worksheets with spaces for mom, dad, siblings, grandparents. Most of the children filled them in eagerly, chattering about aunts and uncles and cousins. Jamie had smiled and talked about decorating their little tree, about how he and his mom baked cookies shaped like stars and snowmen, about the glitter cardboard star he'd made. But then someone, a boy named Marcus with a mean streak, looked at Jamie's worksheet and frowned. Where's your dad? Jamie shrugged, unbothered. I don't have one. The classroom went quiet for a moment. Then the snickers came. So your mom just made you up? Marcus said, loud enough for others to hear. Laughter rippled. Another boy chimed in, emboldened. Maybe your dad saw you and ran away. More laughter. Harsher now. The teacher hushed them, her voice sharp, but the damage was done. The sting had already settled deep in Jamie's chest, burrowing in where words always hurt the most. That evening, Elise returned home from a meeting, tired but looking forward to dinner with Jamie. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, calling out as she always did. Jamie? I'm home. Silence. She frowned, setting down her bag. Jamie? Nothing. Her heart began to beat faster. She moved through the small apartment quickly, checked his room, the bathroom, the kitchen, even the closets where he sometimes hid during hide and seek. His backpack was on his bed. His coat was gone. His shoes, the ones with the light-up soles, were missing from the rack by the door. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. She ran downstairs, knocked on neighbors' doors, her voice rising with each unanswered question. No one had seen him. She called his friends' parents. Nothing. Her hands shook as she dialed the police, her voice breaking as she tried to explain, tried to stay calm. And then, without thinking, she called Callum. He answered on the first ring. Elise. Jamie's gone. The words came out in a gasp, barely coherent. I don't know where. He's not here. I'm on my way. Stay there. Callum, I think I know where he went. The park was nearly empty, blanketed in fresh snow that glowed faintly under the streetlights. The lake stretched out, dark and frozen, and the trees stood like silent sentinels. And there, at the same bench where it all began, sat a small figure bundled in a coat far too thin for the cold. Jamie was curled up, his little knees pulled to his chest, his wool barrier hat slipping over one eye. His mittens were soaked through, his cheeks red and chapped, and his breath came out in soft, visible clouds. Callum approached slowly, his footsteps crunching in the snow. "Hey, buddy." Jamie looked up, and his lower lip trembled. "I'm sorry." Callum sat beside him on the cold bench, the same bench where he'd once sat alone, and he felt the years collapse between them. "Why did you come here?" Jamie glanced at the bench, then at the empty space beside it. "I wanted to see if someone still waited here." "Why would you do that?" His voice cracked, small and fragile. "You were crying that day. And I thought, maybe if I waited here too, someone would come for me. Like they came for you." Callum's throat tightened painfully. He remembered being Jamie's age, sitting outside in the cold, watching other children get picked up by parents who hugged them and called them sweetheart and kiddo. Watching and wondering what invisible thing made him different, made him less. The ache of that waiting never really left. It just learned to hide. He reached out and pulled Jamie into his arms, wrapping his coat around the boy's small, shivering body. "I'm here," he said, his voice thick. "And your mom is looking everywhere for you. Let's go home." Jamie buried his face in Callum's chest and nodded, his voice muffled. "I didn't mean to make her cry. I just wanted to understand." "I know. I know." Back at Elise's apartment, the door burst open before they even knocked. Elise dropped to her knees, her arms out, her face streaked with tears. "Jamie." He ran to her, and she caught him, holding him so tightly he squeaked. She kissed his forehead again and again, her hands trembling as she checked him over. "You're safe. You're safe. That's all that matters." Callum stood in the doorway, watching them, and felt the weight of his own past pressing against his chest, but for the first time, it felt like that past had somewhere to land. Somewhere to soften. Jamie peeked up at him over his mother's shoulder. "Callum." "Yeah. You came for me." Callum crouched beside them both, his voice steady. "Always." That night, after Jamie had been bundled into warm pajamas and given hot chocolate and tucked into bed, Elise and Callum sat together on the couch, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the heater. "Thank you," Elise said softly. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do." She looked at him, her eyes red but clear. "You didn't have to come. You didn't have to care. But you did." He met her gaze, and something passed between them, understanding, recognition, maybe even the beginning of something more. "I care," he said simply. And in the quiet warmth of that small apartment, with snow falling softly outside and a little boy sleeping soundly down the hall, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not with fireworks or declarations. Just quietly. Just enough. The apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and oranges the next evening. Elise had just finished heating a pot of spiced cider on the stove, and Jamie was sprawled on the living room floor, carefully untangling a hopelessly knotted strand of Christmas lights, his tongue poking out in concentration. Their miniature Christmas tree, a scraggly 3-footer they'd reused for the past 3 years, stood in the corner, already leaning slightly to one side despite Elise's best efforts to prop it up with folded cardboard. "Careful with those lights, sweetheart," Elise called gently from the kitchen, stirring the cider. "They're older than you are." Jamie giggled, holding up a tangled ball of glowing red and green bulbs. "I think they're alive, Mommy. They don't want to be tamed." Elise laughed, the sound warm and genuine, and stepped into the living room, drying her hands on a dish towel. Her golden hair was tied loosely at the nape of her neck, a few strands escaping and falling across her cheek as she tucked one behind her ear. The apartment was humble, worn furniture, mismatched throw pillows, walls decorated with Jamie's crayon drawings in cheap frames, but it was warm. Filled with handmade decorations, laughter, and a quiet joy that money couldn't buy. Then the doorbell rang. They both paused. It was Christmas Eve, and they weren't expecting anyone. Jamie scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with excitement. "Maybe it's Santa." "Early." Elise smiled, amused but curious, and followed him to the door. When she opened it, she froze, just for a second, her breath catching. Callum stood there, his black wool coat dusted with snow, his breath fogging in the cold air. In his gloved hands, he held a small but lush pine tree, already strung with twinkling white lights that glowed softly in the darkness. The tree leaned slightly to one side, imperfect and real, and a few needles had already fallen onto his coat. His gloves were mismatched, one black, one dark gray, clearly grabbed in a hurry, and he looked uncertain, almost vulnerable, as if he wasn't sure whether he'd overstepped. "I thought," he said, his voice quiet, clearing his throat. "Maybe your tree could use a little reinforcement." Jamie's eyes went wide, lighting up like the very lights on the tree. "Mr. Callum, you brought backup." Callum laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and genuine. And for the first time since they'd met, it didn't sound restrained or careful. It sounded free. Jamie stepped forward, looked up at the tree, then at Callum, and spoke with all the confidence of a 6-year-old who understood exactly what mattered most in the world. "Mr. Callum," he said seriously, "maybe you don't borrow anymore." He paused, then smiled. "Just stay." The words hung in the cold air between them. Callum blinked, and something inside him, something that had been carefully locked away for most of his life, cracked open. The years of boardrooms and lonely apartments, of success that felt hollow, of polite smiles that never reached his eyes, all of it fell away. And he was left standing there, holding a slightly crooked Christmas tree, looking at a woman and a boy who had, without even trying, become the only family he'd ever really wanted. He looked at Elise. She met his gaze, and something unspoken passed between them, recognition, understanding, permission. Her smile was soft, her eyes warm, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle. "Come in," she said. "We were just about to finish decorating." She stepped aside, her hand brushing back that same loose strand of golden hair, and the gesture felt like more than just an invitation into the apartment. It felt like an invitation into something deeper. Something lasting. Callum stepped inside, carefully carrying the tree, and set it gently beside theirs. Snow melted on his shoulders, dripping onto the worn wooden floor. "It's not much," he said, glancing around at the modest decorations. "But I thought, maybe it would feel more like Christmas." Jamie looked between the two trees, one scraggly and leaning, one small but glowing, and nodded with utmost seriousness. "Now it's a forest." They spent the next hour decorating both trees together. Jamie narrated every ornament with the enthusiasm of a museum tour guide, telling Callum the story behind each one. "This candy cane is from last year. Mommy let me pick it out myself, and I chose the biggest one. And this star, I made it from popsicle sticks and glitter. Mommy says it's the best star she's ever seen, but I think she's just being nice. And this snowflake, I know it looks weird, but it's actually a spaceship. See the wings? Callum listened to every word, smiling, asking questions, treating each ornament like it mattered. Because to Jamie, they did. And somehow, that made them matter to him too. Elise made them cocoa, real cocoa, melted from chocolate bars and mixed with milk and sugar, topped with marshmallows that Jamie insisted on counting to make sure everyone got the same amount. She handed Callum a chipped mug with a faded snowman on the side, and he accepted it with a quiet smile, cradling it in both hands. He sat on the couch, close but not too close to Elise, their shoulders nearly touching. The warmth from the heater mixed with the warmth from the cocoa and the glow of the lights, and for the first time in years, Callum felt something he'd almost forgotten existed: contentment. Jamie, wrapped in a fuzzy blanket that was too big for him, yawned widely and leaned against his mother's side. "This is the best Christmas ever," he murmured, his eyes already drooping. Neither adult spoke. They didn't need to. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and endless, blanketing the city in quiet. Inside, warmth radiated, not just from the heater or the cocoa or the twinkling lights, but from something quieter, steadier. Presence. Belonging. No declarations were made. No grand promises spoken. Just a man who had once sat alone on a bench with a coffee gone cold, now sitting beside a boy who had offered him a place to belong and a woman who had never asked why he stayed, only made space when he did. And in that quiet, ordinary room, borrowing had quietly, gently, become staying. The auditorium lights dimmed to a soft, golden glow, casting a gentle hush over the gathered crowd. Families packed into the rows, parents, grandparents, siblings, coats bundled on laps, phones dutifully silenced, all eyes drawn forward to the small wooden stage wrapped in string lights and handmade paper snowflakes. Outside, the snow still fell in slow, lazy spirals, but inside there was warmth, anticipation, a pulsing energy of something about to begin. Callum sat near the front, surrounded by strangers, yet feeling something entirely unfamiliar: comfort. In his hands was the folded program of the evening's Christmas showcase, its pages slightly crumpled from where he'd held it too tightly. And there, printed near the bottom in simple black text, was the title of the final act, The Boy and the Borrowed Light, written and directed by Elise Grant, starring Jamie Grant. He smiled before he even realized he was doing it. Backstage, hidden in the shadows of the heavy velvet curtain, Elise stood with a headset slightly askew on her head and a clipboard clutched in one hand. Her hair was tied low as always, but several golden strands had escaped, catching the faint glow of the backstage work lights. Her gray wool coat, the same one she'd worn that night in the park, was dusted with flour and glitter from days of frantic preparation. But her eyes were bright, focused, alive with purpose. She whispered last-minute encouragements to the children as they lined up nervously in the wings, adjusted one boy's crooked cardboard halo, smoothed the back of a little girl's wrinkled angel cape. And then, kneeling down so she was eye-level with Jamie, she took his small hands in hers. "You're ready," she said softly, her voice steady and sure. Jamie nodded, but his eyes were wide. "What if I forget a line?" Elise smiled, squeezing his hands gently. "Then you smile, and you borrow a little light from someone in the audience." She glanced toward the curtain, toward where she knew Callum was sitting. "You'll know who." Jamie grinned, his nervousness melting away. "Okay, Mommy." The curtain opened. The stage was simple but beautiful, painted cardboard trees standing like a forest, glowing paper lanterns hung from fishing wire, casting soft, shifting shadows. The audience fell silent as Jamie walked out, small and brave, dressed in simple clothes that marked him as the central figure, a boy searching for the light he'd lost. The scenes unfolded with a charming, heartbreaking simplicity. The boy wandered through shadows, meeting characters along the way, a kind baker who gave him warmth, a lonely musician who gave him a song, a grandmother who gave him a story. Each one offered him a piece of their light, and slowly, the stage grew brighter. But near the end, the boy stood alone once more, center stage, all the other characters having faded into the wings. The lights dimmed until only a single spotlight remained, illuminating Jamie's small figure. He looked out into the audience, his voice clear and steady despite his size. "When you're lost in the dark," he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle, "you can borrow someone's light, until yours shines again." Silence. Not the awkward kind born of confusion or boredom, but the profound kind born of truth. The kind that makes people hold their breath without realizing it. Every adult in the room sat motionless. Some reached for tissues. Others pressed hands over their hearts. Parents looked at their children with new eyes. Callum sat unmoving, his gaze fixed on Jamie, and felt those words cut through every defense he had spent decades building. He didn't cry, he still couldn't, not quite, but something inside him, something old and carefully guarded, bent. Softened. Broke open just enough to let in the light. He turned his gaze toward the wings, where Elise stood hidden from the audience, arms wrapped gently across her chest, watching. Not just the play. Not just her son. But the moment itself, the culmination of months of work, of hope, of belief that stories could still matter. She didn't notice Callum looking at her. She was too absorbed, too present, her face glowing with quiet pride. And in that moment, Callum understood something he'd been circling around for weeks without daring to name it. Elise had always been the borrowed light. From the very first moment, from the snow-covered bench where she'd offered him a cookie, to the coffee shop where she'd shown him his own past, to the nights when she'd let him sit in her living room without asking for explanations, she had been steady. Unwavering. A light that didn't demand anything in return, that simply shone because that was what it did. And he had been in the dark for so long, he'd almost forgotten what warmth felt like. The applause erupted suddenly, thunderous and genuine, filling the auditorium like a wave. Jamie bowed, his face splitting into a huge grin. The other children ran back on stage, holding hands, bowing together. The curtain fell. The lights came up. The room buzzed with joy, with people standing, gathering coats, congratulating one another. But Callum remained seated, fingers still gripping the crumpled program, the last line of the play echoing in his mind. "You can borrow someone's light, until yours shines again," he realized, sitting there in the golden glow of the auditorium, that his light had started to shine again. Not because he'd earned it or bought it or built it himself. But because someone had been willing to share theirs. The snow had softened by the time they reached the park, falling now in slow, lazy flurries that drifted down like feathers, catching in Elisa's hair and on Callum's shoulders. It was late, well past Jamie's bedtime, but none of them had wanted the night to end. The park was quiet, almost sacred in its stillness. The city's noise felt distant, muffled by the snow. The frozen lake stretched out before them, its surface smooth and white. And there, just ahead, was the bench. The same bench where everything had begun. Callum slowed as they approached, his breath misting in the cold air, and for a moment he just stood there, staring at it. Weathered iron. Dusted with snow. Familiar. Elise glanced at him, understanding without words, and then she moved forward, brushing the snow off the seat with her gloved hand before sitting down. Jamie climbed up beside her, his legs swinging off the edge, his barrier hat slightly crooked. Callum followed, sitting on Elise's other side, and the three of them sat together in the quiet. Elise reached into her canvas bag, the same one she always carried, and pulled out the silver thermos. The scent of cocoa drifted up as she unscrewed the cap and poured the warm, sweet liquid into 3 mismatched cups she'd brought, just in case. She handed one to Callum, one to Jamie, and kept the last for herself. Jamie took a careful sip, then pulled something from inside his puffy coat, a folded piece of cardstock, its edges still slightly damp with glitter glue. He opened it carefully, proudly, and held it up for Callum to see. It was a drawing, simple and heartfelt. 3 stick figures sitting on a bench beneath twinkling lights. One tall figure in a long coat with sad eyes. A woman with golden hair, holding out a cookie. A little boy in a bear hat, smiling wide. "That's you," Jamie said, pointing to the tall figure in the middle. "And that's Mommy and me. It's the first time we met." Callum took the card gently, as if it were made of glass, and stared at it. Something tightened in his chest, not painfully, but powerfully. A fullness he wasn't used to. Jamie leaned against his arm, warm and solid and real. "I'm glad you borrowed her that day, Mr. Callum." Elise looked at them both, her expression soft, her smile quiet and true. She sipped from her cup, snowflakes catching in her golden hair, the street lamp behind her casting a gentle halo of light. Callum set the card carefully on his lap and looked at her, really looked at her. And then, slowly, he reached over and took her hand in his. Her fingers curled instinctively into his palm, warm despite the cold. No hesitation. No questions. They didn't need declarations. Didn't need perfect words or orchestrated moments. They just needed this, a bench, a boy, a beginning. Callum turned to Jamie, his voice quiet but steady. "You were right, you know." Jamie tilted his head, curious. "About what?" "That day. When you said I could borrow your mom." Jamie smiled, like it was the most obvious truth in the world. "She's the best." Callum looked back at Elise, his voice soft but sure. "I'm not borrowing anymore." He paused, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I'm staying." She didn't reply right away. She didn't need to. She only smiled, warm and real and full of quiet joy, and leaned her head gently against his shoulder, letting the space where loneliness used to live fill instead with something better. Warmth. Presence. Belonging. And under the soft snow and twinkling streetlights, with cocoa warming their hands and the weight of the past finally lifting, they sat together. A man who had once waited on a bench and found nothing. A woman who gave without asking for anything in return. And a little boy who had seen sadness and offered hope. Together. Not perfect. But whole. Thank you for listening to *. Don't cry, Mr. You can borrow my mom *, a quiet healing journey that began with a child's innocent offer and unfolded into an imperfect but complete little family. If this story touched something in your heart, even for just a moment, please subscribe and hit the like button to support soul-stirring stories. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue bringing heartfelt stories that linger long after they end. See you in the next story, where emotions speak louder than words.